welcome to this episode of the Tennis IQ podcast. I'm Brian Lomax.
And I'm Josh Berger. For today's episode, we're going to be talking about the 2022 Australian Open, which just finished up with on the women's side, Ash Barty taking the championship, and on the men's side, Rafael Nadal winning the title. And I think to get started, there's a lot of why don't we first talk about the finalists and maybe a couple of details from each of these matches, each of these great champions, and then Brian and I are going to discuss some of the parallels between the two champions and some themes related to sports psychology and the mental side of tennis that emerged from these matches. So first, Ash Barty beat the American Danielle Collins in the final in really quite a match, especially the second set where Danielle Collins was up 5-1 and Ash Barty was able to ultimately level the match out and win it in a tiebreaker in that second set, which is quite a comeback. And Nadal's match actually quite a comeback as well. And I'm sure we'll get into everything that led up to this point of especially over these past couple of months and questions over whether he'd even be able to continue playing the sport with the injuries and COVID that he was going through. But coming back from being down two sets, serving at 2-3, love 40, and ultimately turning the match around and winning it in 5 sets against Daniil Medvedev. So I think as a place to start, Brian, why don't we start with the women's final? And I know there's some great quotes that we have by Ash Barty and as well as by Ben Crow, a performance coach as well as mindset coach that has done a lot of work with her. But what were some of your thoughts on Ash Barty and on the women's tournament?
I think on Ash Barty, I noticed a change in her demeanor this year. I think she was really calm and collected the entire tournament, really didn't appear phased by anything in past years, perhaps feeling the pressure and expectations of playing in Australia and wanting to do so well at the tournament. But this year seemed very, like I said, calm and cool, collected, really chill about the whole thing. And it came through in her matches. I mean, other than the final, she really wasn't challenged very much. And the thing, that she was doing, and I feel like her slice backhand was such a big part of her success in this tournament. And when we think of a shot like that, especially, in the women's game, where not as many women players have that shot. Many of them are not necessarily used to facing that shot. It's a real difference maker. It's like, it can really disrupt a person's rhythm very much. And I think that's something that is a true advantage for Ash because she's a very complete player, a lot of different tools that she can use. I mean, she's got the two-hander, but she'll slice a lot and it really bites and stays low. It's a great return for her, yet she's got a great forehand. Her serve is good. So it just gives her so many weapons for her to disrupt things. And she just, really right up until the final was just rolling. And then you brought up the second set against Danielle Collins. And you've got to give Danielle Collins a lot of credit. She didn't have the easiest path. She had a few long matches. She plays very aggressively. You don't want to be facing her return, especially on your second serve. If you don't have a strong second serve, you're not going to win many points. I think like Iga Swiatek did not win many points on her second serve against Danielle. So you got to give her a lot of credit, and as well as, she's fighting like the entire country of Australia in that final. And she's feisty and she can handle that. But I thought what Barty said about her approach at 1-5 was really interesting, and that she wanted to shift herself a little bit, be a little bit more aggressive, try some different things tactically, so that if it came to a third, she'd build some momentum, right? So she wasn't necessarily giving up on the second, but in a way, you're playing a little bit more freely when you're down 1-5, and it started to pay off. That variety started to pay off a lot, and I think Danielle Collins mentioned it in her post-match speech to the crowd about Barty's slice backhand, how she wishes she had or wants to get one of those at some point, and how that was a differentiating factor. So I think it was an interesting way to come back from 1-5 because you just keep playing. You don't know what could possibly happen. And there is, we're going to talk about some of the parallels, but there's certainly a parallel between that and what Daniil Medvedev did against Felix Auger-Aliassime, and how he basically was just going to make Felix work harder and harder in the end. So, yeah, I just thought I was just really impressed by the composure of Ash Barty. In the final, especially, Danielle Collins getting very feisty. Maybe she had to do that because of the crowd, but it really wasn't until the end that you saw any sort of emotion from Barty.
No, absolutely. And as you mentioned, sort of the weight of Australia on her shoulders, being the first Australian to win the title in 44 years. I saw some crazy statistic that I think somewhere around 20% of the Australian public actually tuned in to watch the final, which is pretty incredible. And what's really impressive here with Barty's performance is that, considering the weight of the moment, considering all the expectations, and also how these other top players, have shown great mental toughness at other times, have struggled in similar moments. How she was able to come back from being down 5-1, and as you said, Brian, I think you bring up a great point that when your back is to the wall at that moment, it can actually be easier to play freely and to hit out and not be afraid to miss, because you maybe are not as afraid to lose, right? You maybe assume that you're going to be losing that set at that moment. Maybe you're trying to find your rhythm actually for the third set. So it can actually be, sometimes I think when we see these comebacks, it's because somebody's able to find that rhythm and play looser, play better in that situation. And the person on the other side of the net starts to tense up, and you see the dynamics start to change. And I know we've talked about in the past, but it always takes two to tango in these situations where there's a comeback and a great change in momentum. It's generally both players where something changes. So no, it was really quite a performance, quite a comeback. And I have been very impressed with Barty's humility. Which is definitely something we can, compare to Nadal's, because I think throughout his career, he has shown that every step of the way, whether it was his rivalry with Federer, where he was always sort of deferring to Federer and saying that Federer was the stronger player, or, during Nadal's, more recently, how there's been, constant chatter about him or Djokovic or Federer being the greatest of all time. And he sort of always defers and says, it's not my priority. It's not really my, I'm not in the place to talk about that. So he always tends to answer things in a very humble way, and also, doesn't come at things with a lot of expectations, I think, especially in this tournament. But we'll get to that. But I think a quote that I really liked from Barty with this title now, she is only the second woman in the Open era after Serena Williams to have won a Grand Slam on all three surfaces, on hard courts, clay, and grass. And when that was brought up, she said, "I feel very humbled to be in such a select group. To be honest, I don't really feel like I belong with those champions of our sport. I'm still very much learning and trying to refine my craft and learn every single day and get better and better. It's amazing to be able to have this experience and this opportunity on three different surfaces and be really consistent across the board." And then she also added, ultimately, that was one of the biggest challenges that Jim Joyce, who's her childhood coach, set out for me when I was young, to be a complete player and be really consistent across all the surfaces and be able to play on all surfaces, which I think, first of all, it's great for a coach to have that as a goal, to be able to play on different surfaces. I mean, I think maybe, one area that a lot of players could improve on is gaining the experience from playing on different surfaces. But I think back to the point about humility, it just shows that, she says, despite being number one in the world, despite having now won 3 Grand Slams and, being the most consistent player, at least, over the last couple of years, you could say, um, is, she feels like she's still very much learning. She's trying to refine her craft. Definitely coming at it with, a growth mindset, it seems, rather than feeling that, letting the titles and the ranking get to her head and, allowing her ego to grow from that. She comes at it that she's still very much learning. So I think that humility is definitely one of the factors that has allowed her to get to this point, and I think will continue to help her as her career goes on.
The humility as well as the desire to learn is really important. Famous American football coach Bill Walsh talked about how that if the environment is all about learning, the results will come. And I think that's what you're seeing with a player like Ash Barty, and the idea of her being a complete player, which is true. And hopefully we'll see more young women trained to play, more like Ash Barty. I think we've discussed on this show in the past how maybe there was an era where that wasn't as much the case. Maybe late 70s and for good maybe 20 or 30 years. Many female players were just brought up with two-handed backhands, giant forehands, and then that's it. And where prior to that, during the wood um, racket era, the women played exactly like the men. If you were to watch like Billie Jean King highlights, she's serving and volleying. She's got a great slice backhand, just amazingly athletic player, total complete game, and something that you really don't see very much, on the women's tour today. And I think Ash Barty be a great example for many young women to emulate in terms of how to play, and make them more complete. It makes me think of our conversation with Coach Bill Tim and the idea of how many years it takes to learn all those skills, and then the additional years it takes to become a champion. And obviously, Ash is figuring it out, but with her, her love of learning and improving and her humility, who's to say how good she can get? And just the way she handled the pressure in this tournament, Josh. Because you're right, lots of players have faltered with some level of history on the line. But if you're not all that interested in history, perhaps that's the answer. Because you can go back to sort of the way Nadal approached this tournament. He really wasn't entering it to win number 21. It was sort of a nice afterthought or footnote for him, but ultimately it came down to him just wanting to play the sport he loves.
Absolutely, and I think that's a good transition where Nadal, spoke. I think at the end of the tournament, maybe during the tournament at some point, just about all the struggles that he had that I don't think most people were aware of. That
Right.
he had this nagging foot injury, I think since the middle of last year, and he talked about even not being sure that he'd be able to continue playing, and then he had COVID in December, which apparently sidelined him pretty badly. So it seemed he did go into Australia and won the warm up tournament in Melbourne, which I'm sure gave him some confidence and getting those matches under his belt. But still, I mean, considering how recently he had COVID and how recently he had even thoughts of whether he'd be able to continue playing or not, to come into a tournament with low expectations for yourself, just trying to maybe get some matches, maybe try to play your way into form to an extent. I think was one of the keys for his success. I think also whether it's Barty's comeback in that second set or Nadal's comeback in the final, I think giving yourself a little bit of time and being patient and can do wonders. I think one time, something that I see at certainly the lower levels of the sport is somebody's down in a set or somebody's down in a match and they assume that it's just going to continue that way, that their opponent is just going to continue playing at the same level, that nothing's going to change. And sometimes that turns into tanking, because they assume that what's the point of sticking around here? But I think what Barty and Nadal both showed through both of these are pretty insane comebacks is that the ability to just stick around, be patient. Sometimes you'll find your game and start to find your rhythm. Where I think that was definitely the case with Nadal, where he started off the match quite tight in that first set, and Medvedev was playing incredible, serving incredible. Hardly missed a backhand. Um, and Nadal was patient. He stuck with him, and eventually was able to turn it around. But that only happens if if you allow it to. If you start to tank, if you don't try your hardest, if you mentally or emotionally let your game falter, then you don't give yourself a chance to make that sort of a comeback. I
Yeah.
think also, yeah, yeah. Sorry, what were you saying?
No, go ahead, Josh. Yeah.
No, I was going to say the other point is on the other side of things, and we can certainly say a lot of positives about Medvedev. I mean, he's become one of the top players in the world right now, and has shown a lot of consistency, especially over the last year, and is playing at a really high level. But one of the things that I noticed about him in the final was how his demeanor really changed. Where the beginning of the match, he was a lot more calm and collected. And as the match went along, and maybe there was, some other reasons, could have to do with the heat or the, him tiring, but mentally he started to slip as well. He started having a lot of chatter with the umpire, started getting annoyed with the fans. He started doing this thing that I'm sure many of us have seen, where he'll miss a shot or make an unforced error and sort of do a sarcastic applause, as if he's applauding himself after missing a shot. So, and as we've talked about in the past, when you're frustrated, when you're focused on something outside your control, like the fans or like the umpire, it's going to be really hard to really stay focused on the task at hand, stay focused on that next point or your game plan or your strategy. I think we also saw this at other points of the tournament, certainly. I think an example being the Shapovalov Nadal match, where Shapovalov was letting things get to him as well, such as Nadal and the amount of time he was taking. But I think I think what I noticed in the final in terms of Medvedev's behavior and his reaction as the match went along, is definitely relates to some of these themes that we've talked about in terms of controlling your emotions, and how when the emotions can get to your head, that's going to ultimately prevent you, for I would say the vast majority of players out there, that's going to prevent you from playing your best brand of tennis.
And I think with both Shapovalov and Medvedev in the matches that you're referring to, those things that occurred were completely predictable,
Mm-hmm.
and should be things that any player should have a plan for. Like we talked about a few episodes ago, mental contrasting. Those would be exact kinds of things you would put into your mental contrasting plan, right? You want to win the match, but there are obviously going to be some obstacles. So yes, the crowd could be an obstacle. The you know How will you handle the fact that Nadal does take a lot of time between points? Maybe he will get some extra, well, not credit, but maybe the umpire will not, hold Rafa to the same standard, perhaps. And so I think just a lesson for all of us is, again, let's think about some of those things that could distract us, have distracted us in the past, and make sure we have a plan so that when it does happen, you're not distracted, like exactly as you're saying, Josh, because both players, I think, suffered losses of focus in those matches, and that might have been critical. I think it certainly was a factor in the final. And what's interesting is that in Medvedev's match with Felix Auger-Aliassime, he talked about how he thought during the match, well, what would Novak do? And this is actually, I think, another opportunity for Medvedev to be introspective here and say, okay, what would Novak do, to prepare for a crowd being against him? Because it's certainly something he's had to deal with on a number of occasions. And those matches that have been, kind of historic, that Novak's been playing Roger or Rafa, he hasn't let that bother him. Like that 2019 Wimbledon final. I mean, the place was going nuts for Federer, and Novak handled it. I think he even said something to the effect of like when they were cheering Roger's name, his response to that was they're cheering my name. So I think that's something that Medvedev could learn from Novak in that regard. So yeah, I think it was a good. It was a nice highlight of what mental contrasting is and what happens when you don't do it. When you're not ready for predictable things to go wrong.
I think that's a great point, because we see as tennis players, you should be able to start picking up on patterns that emerge. Okay, I react this way due to this situation, or also I'm playing an opponent today that has a habit of doing this. Everybody knows Nadal tends to take time in between points. Sometimes he gets warnings or from the umpire or point penalty even. So it shouldn't come as a surprise when you're facing Nadal and that happens. But if you let that get to you, if you don't have a plan, as you're saying, then that's going to ultimately hurt your performance. And I think that was one of the factors in that 5-set battle between Shapovalov and Nadal that was ultimately the deciding fact, one of the deciding factors. So I think that's definitely something that can be learned from. And I think Medvedev to some extent, and I know we talked about this off air, and maybe some people who are listening may disagree, but I know he spoke in his press conference after the match about and maybe we can link to this, because I think I want to make sure we do it justice here, but talked about growing up and playing in the junior Grand Slam tournaments, and feeling that maybe the crowd was against him, maybe unfairly, and I think also thinking about what some of his behaviors and some certain comments that he's made and how that contributes to that. And I think you bring up a good point, Brian, that knowing that the crowd, when they're trying to watch, when there's an opportunity to watch history, and Nadal's going for his 21st title, the crowd is going to want to have been there for that, especially somebody like Nadal, who's beloved, as is Federer. It's predictable that the vast majority of the crowd is going to be against you in that situation. So have you prepared? Do you have a plan to handle that? And I think Medvedev will learn from it. And Medvedev also has a way of using the crowd to his advantage in a certain way, even if they are against him. We saw this in 2019 when Medvedev made his run all the way to the U.S. Open finals, and the crowd was very much against him as the tournament started. And he's, I think through his personality to a large part, by the end of the tournament, a lot of the crowd was rooting for him, even if it wasn't the majority against Nadal. But I think he can, figure out how he can continue to use those sorts of dynamics and use his personality to get the crowd to his advantage, or even if people are against him, he can feed off that energy in a way that I think he has successfully in the past. But I think based on his reaction after the match, and maybe even during the match, I question if he was able to feed off it and to use that energy as he has in the past. But I think instead it seemed to get in his head, especially once the match started turning around. And I think it can be easy, once things start to shift and all this, first of all, you were ahead 2 sets, you had the advantage in the 3rd set, and then all of a sudden things start to shift. It can be easy to not look for excuses per se, but certain things can get on your nerves more so at that point. So I think I imagine it will be a learning experience. I think for his age, he's quite mature. He's clearly very smart. I think he'll definitely learn it use it as the learning experience, and I anticipate him sticking around for a long time. And whether he is received as more of a Djokovic figure or more of a Federer Nadal figure, or his own type of personality and being received in his own way, I think is still very much to be seen. I mean, he's still very early in his career, especially if he is going to be following in the big three's footsteps.
You made me. You were describing, Medvedev's reaction to this whole thing and how sometimes he uses it, sometimes he doesn't work. I think when you engage with some of these negative emotions, they can be hard to control, meaning that sometimes they can take you to a good place where you're motivated and more intense and more energized. And then other times they take you to a place where you become unfocused and unable to really achieve what you're trying to do out there. And so those are, I think, they're difficult emotions to engage with. You don't see too many people successful with that. So, like you said, Medvedev's had some success, but the only guys I can really think about or think of that have had true success with that kind of approach are Jimmy Connors and John McEnroe. They were able to do that for the most part and stay focused. Connors better probably than anybody at that. So he could mix it up with the crowd, mix it up with his opponent, mix it up with umpires, and it seemingly never really affected him. There were times where McEnroe took it too far and maybe did lose focus, but it's really hard, I think, when people engage with some of those negative emotions. I hope that Medvedev can take an extreme ownership perspective on this because he certainly owns part of the responsibility. Um, no one's making him do sort of the mock clap or the fake thumbs up type thing that he's doing. And none of us would ever imagine like Rafael Nadal doing that. I mean, when Rafael Nadal used to play either French guys at the French Open early in his career, or even when he played Federer in multiple finals, he was never the crowd favorite. But you did not see him engaging with these emotions. He just stayed focused on doing what he needed to do. He was just relentless. And for those of us who remember those days, there was a really large Federer contingent and a small but growing Nadal contingent, which got bigger and bigger as the years went along. But it wasn't like it was equal at first. It clearly wasn't. And especially in places like Paris, where Federer was just totally beloved, and he should be. He's a great ambassador for the game. He plays with such flair and style, and if it weren't for Nadal, he'd be probably the next greatest clay court player ever in the history of the game, right? So I think there are multiple role models for Medvedev to look at if you want to be able to handle these situations. You brought up what he said in his press conference and how maybe the behavior of the crowd has somewhat ruined the dream of the young child tennis player that he once was. And I read that and I was like, I hope he can reflect on that in a few days or weeks, that we shouldn't let the behavior of other people detract us or distract us from what we want to achieve. These people in the end shouldn't be that important to him, right? He should only care about his team and the other people around him that love him. And but at the same time, like we've been saying, he's got to own how he responds to this stuff. Because where it goes from here, it's kind of up to him. There was a very famous incident with Jimmy Connors. I want to say it was the 1978 U.S. Open. I could be wrong on this, but he was not well liked prior to that. But at that tournament, in that final, he said something to the New York crowd about, like, you may not like me very much, but I love you guys. And he was a fan favorite ever since. And so, I think it's within Medvedev's control to deal with the crowd and how they engage with him. But also, he's got to figure out various situations when he's playing various guys in various countries, what the dynamic is going to be, and he's got to have a better plan than what he had in Australia.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as as his career goes on, he will have more of a contingency of fans,
Definitely.
more diehard fans. I mean, I think it can be easy to forget because he's number two player in the world right now. I think in many ways with Djokovic out, he was the favorite going into this tournament, but he just won his first Grand Slam last fall in New York, last year. So he's still I think figuring some of this out, and in many ways I think he does still need to build his fan base and figure out what works best for him. Where I think with him we see more of a range of his emotions, where sometimes he'll win a match or he'll win a big point and won't react at all, and other times, he'll let out more of a reaction or be more on the negative side. So I think he's still in a certain way figuring out what works best for him, it seems. But I think I imagine we'll be seeing a lot more of him as the years go on, and he'll have plenty more opportunities to, especially with, the big three getting older and older, though it just seems that they might just continue winning tournaments, Grand Slam tournaments. But I anticipate he'll have plenty more opportunities at the highest level to continue refining his craft as it relates to the mental game and as it relates to reacting to these sorts of situations.
Yeah, I agree. And I find myself rooting more and more for him. I really like his game. I like what he does out there. I mean, his physical game is completely, you can't copy any of that, but it's amazing.
Unorthodox.
Yeah, to say the least, right? But it's amazing to watch what he does. You can see how he interacts with the other players, that there's a ton of respect there. How he was with Nadal at the end of the match was fantastic. So I think there are no issues at all there. I think he's great with the other players, and so yeah, if he can just figure out how to handle this and not let unimportant people's behaviors interfere with what he wants to achieve in his life, I think that would be great for him because I think he there's just something about him. He's dynamic. He's got a good personality, like you said. He's smart. He's really well spoken. Yeah, really, I like watching his interviews. I like watching his game. So let's hope he is around for many years to come because the game is better with him, no doubt about it.
Definitely.
You know, um, perhaps we could switch a little bit to Rafa now. Given that this was an historic achievement, although that wasn't really what he was focusing on.
Right. Right. No, I mean, he was asked about it after the match, now that he has won his 21st Grand Slam title and, jumps ahead of Federer and Djokovic, sorry, who are still at 20 Grand Slams. And, there's this constant question over who is the greatest of all time. And I think that this quote by him where he says, at this moment in history, it's true that I'm the one with the most, he said. Of course, I would be happy to finish with the most, but for me, it's never been an obsession. Whatever happens from now with Novak, Roger, or me, we all have exceeded any expectations we could have had when we were young. So, I think this, he comes at it in sort of a more objective way, where he's not, bringing his own ego into it, his own emotions. I'm sure, a part of him does want to finish his career with more titles. Certainly he gets a lot of questions about it, but he seems to really come at things from a focus on the process, a focus on doing things right, a focus on trying to master his craft, focus on coming back time after time after time after time throughout his career from injuries, from setbacks. I mean, I cannot think of any player who has dealt with as many injuries as he has, and time again has been able to come back to the highest level. Sometimes it's been a longer absence, sometimes it's been a shorter absence. I think when you're 35, I'm sure it's tougher than when you're younger to come back to that level. But I think his resilience and how he doesn't seem to have too many expectations for himself, especially in this situation,
Yeah.
considering what he'd been through with his injuries and his sickness. But I think that goes a long way to performing the way that he did, because he allows himself to not get flustered at different situations that come his way, and I think he gave himself time, just as he gave himself time. He sort of bought himself time in that third set in order to come and turn that match around. I think, you know, he was able to sort of buy himself time by keeping his expectations low, by, starting small and winning a 250 event, and then, winning round by round and letting his confidence build.
I like his final answer in his press conference after the final, and he was asked, really what were his keys to, to success as in this tournament. And I'll just read the quote: "Love for the game, passion, positive attitude, and working spirit. That's all. No, and the right people next to me helping every single day. I think that's all." And those first ones are, you can see it in him, because when you have sort of an existential crisis a few months prior to the event that you may not be able to play again. You're training and it's not working. So, like you said, some days he could play for 5 minutes, some days no minutes, some days an hour and a half. And it wasn't getting better at all. Um, and uh, and so I think he felt extremely grateful to just be there and to play the game he's loved since he's been a young boy, and that really carried through. He also mentioned that late in the match that it was helpful to think about some of the other tough losses, because I think he's mentioned this. He's had some of the toughest losses of his career at that tournament. You know, two of them in a final, but there were some other really tough losses that were in semifinals and so forth. But that one against Novak that went almost 6 hours, the 2017 final against Federer when he had a lead in the fifth, and yeah, he's had some really tough moments there. But he almost like, all right, that fueled him to go through in the end. And I think you're right, Josh. I don't think there were expectations for this tournament. Simply just wanted to play. And we shouldn't blow off the part where he talks about having the right people. We all go through things in our lives, and it's really important that we have a team of people around us that either keep us grounded or help us through these tough times. We tend to call that in sports psychology, social support. Social support is really so important when we're dealing with things like injuries or questions about our career or whatever. We need that in good times and bad. And Rafa clearly has that. And when going back to Medvedev, those are the people he should really care about and what they think. And he had some really nice words for his team as well at the end. But I think that's an important aspect of this is having the right people in your life for your tennis career or whatever your professional career is. Family, friends, coworkers, or people that you practice with, or whatever, physio. All of that really matters, and that you trust these people and that you can talk to these people about difficult things, and that they have your back. And I think that's something that Rafa realizes is he's got a great team that is there 100% for him, and he knows that without those people, he wouldn't have been in that position on that day.
Yeah, and as it relates to his team, a lot of the people on his team are people that have been with him for a long time.
Yeah.
I mean, his uncle Tony Nadal, who actually I don't think is working with him as much right now. I think is actually helping out Felix, and I know is very involved in Nadal's academy. But I know that a lot of the way that Nadal was raised, and we've talked about some of his qualities and his humility and his focus on the process has a lot to do with the way that he learned the sport from Tony. And as you talk about the people around him, I think these people that are around him in many ways help to build the person that he is.
100%.
So I think that that's an important point, that he's been around a lot of these people, and it's a lot of people from his community too. Other Spanish people, other people from Mallorca. So it's people that he knows well, he trusts, and I think we can all learn from and think about who we incorporate, within our performance team, and who are the type of people that we can learn from, we can grow from, and are going to ultimately help us to perform at our best. But I think even more importantly, to be the best people we can be.
Yeah, right. I think when you look at Rafael Nadal, you do think of a guy who's someone of good character, has good virtues. Um, we don't necessarily always want to put athletes up on some sort of pedestal as role models or so forth, but if you had to choose one, he's a pretty good one. The way he conducts himself on and off the court, there's not much you can say bad about the guy. I'm sure some people could, and whether that's based in truth or not, is one thing. But yeah, the way he handles himself and the humility that you mentioned, Josh, those are all the things that have made him so great at what he's done. Without that sort of humility and the hard work and the character building that his uncle and his parents and his family and even Carlos Moyo, he's known since he was young. That all forged him into this sort of ultimate warrior tennis player that, in many ways, we've never really seen before. I think arguments about greatest of all time are nice, but they're really kind of inconsequential in many ways. But there's no one else who consistently fights the way he fights. And um, if you had somebody that you wanted to play for your life, he wouldn't be a bad choice for that. So I was really pleased to see him pull this off. And I think I said to you before we began recording, um, I've never seen him so exhausted, and I'm sure that part of that was the not the normal training time that he would have, as well as COVID in December, and just watching him manage his energy between points. If a game was 40 love, not running for the ball, those are things you don't normally see from him. And it was just remarkable to see how he managed his energy, because both players, I think, were exhausted. I think that was a factor at the end. And I don't think we've mentioned this one in a while, but exhaustion, fatigue can really have an impact on a player's will to win. Certainly on their ability to focus. You can get very
Decision making.
yeah, just you can be really focused on how tired you are.
Yeah.
So it can become a real sort of mental breaking point when you're physically so exhausted. And I think it was impressive the way he handled that. Um, and not that Medvedev handled it badly, but just like I was just impressed the way Nadal managed that situation, because it's not, you don't normally see that from him.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. I think the irregular training could definitely have been a factor there, or the fact that he had some long matches leading up to it,
Yeah.
or the fact that he's simply a lot of he's 35, almost 36 now. So, and especially for a player who's relied on his speed and movement throughout his career, it takes a toll. So I think those are all factors, but yeah, I think that anytime there's a grand slam, especially on the men's side where they're playing best out of 5 sets and you have to win 7 matches, it's going to take a toll. To some extent, it's going to be a marathon for whoever ends up winning the tournament. It's going to be endurance is definitely going to be a piece. The physical aspect is definitely going to be a piece of it. So, the ability to keep it together over the course of 2 weeks and not let your level slip, and also, when it comes down to the final, to you know conserve energy maybe at times, which, as you said, is not something we usually see from him. Usually, people say he plays every point the same way. You can't tell if he's down 40 love, or if it's love 40, or if it's deuce, because he's playing every point as if it's his last. But we actually did see him maybe not take points off, but play certain points and maybe take certain chances that he wouldn't normally take, because of that exhaustion. So I think the ability that he was able to fight through that, and able to fight through losing those 2 sets, being down in the third, fighting off those break points, but also in the fifth set. I mean, he was up in the fifth, up a break, going to serve forward at 5-3, and was broken. 5-3 or 5-4.
5-4, I think.
5-4. 5-4. Yep, was broken to bring it to 5-all, and then it was able to break Medvedev right back. Perhaps Medvedev's exhaustion and physical ailments in that moment could have been part of it, but no, just a testament to him. And we'll see what ends up happening when the big three all retire, but definitely, regardless, quite an achievement.
Absolutely. And we're pretty lucky to be tennis fans at this moment in time. Yeah, these guys, Novak and Roger and Rafa are getting a little bit older, and maybe we're at the end. Although I think if Novak can figure things out, he has more gas in the tank maybe than the other two. But we shouldn't hustle these guys into retirement. We'd love to have them as long as they can get out there, and they love the sport, right? So, yeah, this was a fun tournament to watch these last couple of weeks. A lot of great matches. So, well, everybody, thank you for listening to this episode. For more, please check out the show notes. If you have any feedback or questions for me and Josh, please email us at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. You can also use the Twitter hashtag tennisiq. Additionally, please subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice, including YouTube, so you can be notified of new episodes. And you can also check us out on Instagram. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon in our next episode.